is new is that I'm reluctant to use the word, but there's been a bit of a pushback, and I think there's also an acceptance by community that, that life can be better and community can be better by including people. The other thing I wanted to say about, I'm not sure why it's in here, but it is in here. Schools like Girralang are few and far between, and I know that there's educators in here and all sorts of things, and excuse me, I'm out of water now. One of the things that happens with schools like Girralang, and Bruce was talking about it yesterday, thank you. Not yesterday, just next door. We had a few people have lunch next door, and he was talking about how families become, they move areas to be able to go to schools like Girralang. They end up going there, and all of a sudden Girralang becomes the special school. People change religion to become part of Catholic so that they can go to the Catholic school. There's religious conversions that go on, and it's true, because a school who is inclusive, who does the right thing by people, it just attracts people because they say, I want that. And one of the things I guess we encourage is for people to look to the local community. If you are a faith-based person and that faith is important to you, then that should be something. But you shouldn't be going to a school because they're doing inclusion well, although that doesn't make a lot of sense. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's important that you ask of the school who is your local community or who is your local faith-based thing, what is right because it's right. And you get caught up in this rights-based approach thing, and I think that's the wrong conversation to be having a lot of the time. It's advocacy should never be adversarial. And Bruce talked about that before, that you don't go to a meeting by yourself. Having said that, Jan and I are always going to meetings by ourselves and coming out and saying, why did we do that? But for some people came to me before or asked questions before about how do you achieve this? And I just reiterate what Bruce said, you don't do it by yourself. Melissa didn't get to Girralang by herself. Maybe she went to that particular conversation and did it, but it took a lot of work to get there, and it's not something that happens overnight. Our journey started a long, long time ago. Rhonda's started a long, long time ago. It doesn't happen overnight, and you do really need to be able to peel that onion skin off, because I keep talking about that. I guess the other thing that I did want to talk about was this notion of vision, because we talked about it, and it even came into this conversation before lunch about how we get this funding because there's a need. And one of the dangers in the NDIS is that the needs start driving the vision. And it's really important that you get that sorted out in your head. If your needs are driving your vision, you're kind of screwed before you start. Seriously. Somebody asked me yesterday, it's really good to see what somebody else is getting, then I can ask for that as well. And I said to them, but that's not what it's about. The NDIS is a needs-based funding on what is fair and reasonable. And if you are asking for stuff because somebody else is getting it, then you are basing your vision on somebody else. And that's not what this is about. And I guess that's why it's important that the NDIS is part of this conference for sure, and we talk about that. But it's the visioning part, it's the planning, this is the space I want to get to, this is how I'm going to get there. And Anne Greer talked about that, I think, before lunch, and it's really important that you get that. And some of you may not be in a position to even start visioning. Well, my life is so screwed I can't think about anything. And what's really important when you get into that space is that you don't start thinking about the vision part of it, you start thinking about what is it you don't want. If you can't work out what you do want, what is it you don't want? And a lot of the conversations in this particular room has come out that, well, I'm looking for an inclusive life, but people are not really sure what that means. I mean, a lot of schools are not sure what inclusion means. So it's just really important that we understand that as well. I'm talking too long, Rhonda. You need to stop me. The secondary schools part of that, for me it's really important for people with a secondary, in secondary situations to be really clear about that vision, because all of a sudden you go to this framework where you've got students with Natalie and Sky all day, every day, and it's a beautiful relationship that happens. But then when you get to year 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all of a sudden you've got 50 minutes or 40 minutes, and that segmented part of it, it's really hard to get your head around as a kid with a disability. And to be able to understand that, I think as families and as schools, we need to be really intentional on the vision. and then the needs that are created by that vision. It's not just the vision of the kids, it's the vision of the school as well. So all schools have got some sort of vision and they've got some sort of expectation about the kids that they want to produce. What's really clear in this situation is that we focus on those things, and every school's different. And I think that inclusion in too many cases, it's the word that's bandied around about, and we need to really unpack what inclusion means. And I think the other part of that is that something that we haven't really talked about a lot today is that, or even yesterday, is the effect it has on the wider community. So the fact that ALIA's in Girulang is a marvellous thing, but how does that affect the wider community? Does that affect them in a negative impact? Because there will be kids that would say, well, this is causing, and you hear of all sorts of instances where some kids just had some sort of a moment and lashed out and kicked and things like that, and how schools do with that. So I think as parents we need to be aware of that and be prepared to have those conversations in a non-adversarial way. Does that make sense? So you can't ignore the fact that there's interactions between kids, and particularly in year 8, 9 and to a lesser extent year 7 and 10, like kids, I don't know what happens in year 8 and 9, but it's different. It's just different. And my daughter came home the other day from school and she said, and she was in tears because this kid called somebody else some sort of, you're an autistic retard. And so that was quite confronting for her, who is a person with lots of empathy, having come with a family like ours. You've got no choice. But it was really hard for her to work that out. And so where do I as a parent go with that? Where do I as a teacher go with that? And it's about the intentionality of the conversations that we have with our kids and how we support them in those situations. I talked about with my Connect group the other day, so that's a pastoral group or what else, I can't think of another word for it, homeroom, those sorts of things. And the kids were talking about different things. I think we were talking about that site where the girls have been uploaded with pictures and stuff like that. And we talked about this whole notion of, I've got a mate that's a publican, he runs the Coogee Bay Hotel, he used to run the Stain, so pretty hardcore pubs in Sydney, and he's a tough guy, he knows what's going on. And he talked about the 5 people turn into a dickhead policy, 5 people in a dickhead policy. So what that means is that if you walk into a pub with a mate, and there's 3 or 4 of you, and your mate does something stupid, what will happen is that you will tell him to stop it. But if you go in there with 20 people and somebody does something stupid, everybody steps back and lets him go on with it. And I think that's the intentionality of the conversations that you need to have with kids around disability, because they don't get it. It's really hard for them to understand how to interact with somebody who might be seen as different, particularly if that person has been in a segregated position for a long time. I won't go into that story because I'm talking too much already. How much longer have we got? The only other thing I did want to talk about was content. And Natalie talked a lot about how to differentiate. And you go to a Down Syndrome Association conference, or you go to a workshop, or you go to an autism workshop, and typically what you'll get is a piece of paper with a kid with some sort of described piece of paper, and then you talk about how to include him in your physics class or something like that. That's the notion of how those things work. And I was talking to Bruce before he came over here, and he said, look, the reality is the people who want to include their kids in the classroom will include them, and they will find a way. And one of the things that I've always found as a teacher in including kids, I remember when Ruth came to my class, and I'm thinking, how the heck am I going to teach binomial expansions to this kid? And I talked to Rhonda and she wanted me to do this for method, and I thought, no, that's not going to work, and worked out that we could do this other approach. And so it becomes about knowing the student. And whilst I did go and talk to Rhonda about it, I kind of felt there was a better way to do it, and I felt that way because I actually knew some of her attributes. And I think this notion that we can sit down and even share, I forget whose vision we were talking about this morning, that we can make assumptions based on people's a written down piece of paper on how to include a people. I think those things are very important, but the real differentiation and the real welcoming, the real belonging and the real learning happens when we really know our kids, and that doesn't happen unless we know them. And how do you get to know a kid when he first comes to your room and you think you've got 30 kids in your room, or 25 or whatever it is, and oh my God, it's the start of the year and I've got to know this kid and I don't. And my suggestion to you would be to ring up the parents and have that conversation, because the parents are the experts of your child. I mean, Natalie talked about it before and Sky talked about it before, that Melissa's part of the conversation that comes with A's education. And the last thing I did want to talk about before I let Rhonda go was the whole sense of outcomes and ILPs. And ILPs are very important documents, and so are outcomes and things like that. And I think where possible, and you'd probably tend to agree, that the outcomes should be comparable with the other kids. If kids are learning count, square numbers, and a kid doesn't know how to count to 10, then you need to work out, well, how am I going to teach square numbers to a kid that can't count past 5? And I was in that situation last year with Jack. I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do? And the suggestion was made, well, let's just push the calculator buttons. And I'm thinking, no, we can do better than that. So I gave him 12 counters and said, put them in a square, and he couldn't do it. So we knew that 12 wasn't square, and gave him 9, and he was able to put that in the square, and he made that 9. So again, like, I can give lots of advice in instances, but it's really hard without knowing the kid and without knowing the outcomes. And my suggestion to you is there needs to be a bloody good excuse to not go for the outcomes that the other kids are going for. Like a really good excuse from my perspective. I'm not sure what Rhonda thinks, I'm not sure what you guys think, but outcomes are how we measure ourselves, and if there's no measurement, then we run the risk of jumping the lowest possible bar, and that's not on. You need to challenge kids, you need to challenge every kid.